have nothing in this directory besides one Terraform file, and it's empty. So in the interest of time, I'm going to copy and paste chunks of code, which I've kind of got in a different script to build this. But again, I will explain everything as I go. So the very first thing we want to do is instantiate Terraform. So what we're going to do is going to drop in a block called Terraform. And this is going to say, I'm requiring the Azure Resource Manager, and the source is HashiCorp/Azure RM. And what that means is it's going to pull it in. It is all open source. It's all on GitHub. You can access it, create tickets, and add code if you like. But we're going to be using this one, the Azure Resource Manager. Second to that, hopefully you can see that. Actually, I'll zoom in a little bit more. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so the next block that we're going to want to do is we want to initialize the provider. And what that means is telling it we are going to be calling these APIs. So we've already said we want to use it, but now we have to initialize it. We have to say this provider is in here. And this way you put extra features. So if you wanted to, I don't know, I don't even really know what goes in now. I've never used it, but extra features for the Azure Resource Manager APIs, you would put them in here. Now, thinking about what we want to be doing, we're going to be logging into a container registry at some point to pull the image. So we are going to want some variables. Now, these variables, we want the username and password. So if I drop in the CR username and the CR pass, let's actually close that one down because we don't really care for that one at the moment. So variable CR user and CR pass, it's container registry username, container registry password, and we're going to give them a type of string. And that's just telling Terraform that this is going to be inside quotes. It's just going to be a string of, well, a data type of string, essentially. After that one, we're going to think about naming. So when I name this app service, I kind of touched on it in the presentation, but you want it to be unique every time. Now, there's a way you can do that, and there are some predefined ways in Terraform that you can do it. And one of them is just by saying random UUID. And I've just called it unique identifier in this instance. And all this is going to say is every time I call this block, there's nothing in it, but every time I call it, it's just going to return a random number for me, a random unique identifier. So that then leads us to our resources. So we've got all our predefined bits and bobs. So we've got the variables, we've got the random unique identifier, we have got the definition for the Azure Resource Manager. We now want to create an app service plan. Now, if I drop this one in, so this is quite a big block, but I will go through it. So let me just make sure there's plenty of space on the screen. Okay, so let's talk through this. Resource, we're calling the Azure Resource Manager App Service Plan API, and we are calling it App Service Plan just locally. So this is how I refer to it if I ever wanted to get something out. Now, I've left these two comments in here because if we're going to be creating a resource group, we don't need to, but if we did, we could access the location of it. So anything that's predefined above or in a different block, we can access. But let's take those out for now. I just wanted to leave them in there to show you. I have actually named it UK South. So I have called the name Liam Hampton DevOps App Service Plan. And that's because that's unique to me. I know that's unique. I could put a random UUID on it, but I don't want to. For this one, I want to show you that in a different block. We have the location, which is UK South. Again, keeping consistent where all of my other resources are. You can have this wherever you like, but it's all dependent upon cost, where you are, what's best, and what suits, because not every resource is available in every location, remember that one. The resource group name, which is Liam DevOps Series. Now, I have got that from my resource group name in the cloud. So if you remember, I created a resource group. I named it Liam DevOps Series. So if I was to have a quick look in here. So in here, we've got resource group Liam DevOps Series. What else we got? We have got the kind, which is Linux. And this is going to tell it that we want this to be, or what's going to run on this app service plan is a Linux machine. And we have to say it's reserved as true. Now, I'll come back to this and why afterwards, because it makes sense with the other blocks once I've put them in. The SKU, if you remember when I did the last one, I think I chose basic. But because of what I want to do and where I want to go forward, so forward planning, I'm actually going to create a standard one, and I'm going to give it the size of an S1. So it's only a small standard tier. Really, really cheap. I think if I was to do this in the portal, it might come up at like $9 a month. But for what I'm going to use, it's not going to be anywhere near as much. It will be a couple of pence, I think, at best for me. Like I said, if you're going to run it for the whole month and have it absolutely bombarded with traffic, that might cost you more money. But for me, this is perfectly fine, and I don't need it to be any more than that. So we have an app service plan. When we have an app service plan, we want to create an app service. So the next block is super big. So we're going to do this in chunks. So we're going to create an app service. So here we go. So this is the start of it. So this is the first bit. We are going to give it, again, the name of the resource. When we're calling the API, it's called app service. We're going to name it app service locally. So whenever I reference this locally in this file, I'm just going to call app service dot if I want anything from it. And here's a really, really good example of using that dot notation. So with the unique identifier, we have called the random UUID unique identifier. So we've called the resource itself, which is up here, random UUID. And we've called this block, which is unique identifier, which we can see here. And then we're just going to get the result. Now, I know for a fact this returns a result, but it's very much the same when you're writing JSON in JavaScript or going through any kind of sort of lists in that sense. I know it returns as a result, so I'm going to give it .result at the end. And I'm just going to do -Liam's world website. So this means every single time this script is run, a new application will be spun up with a random unique identifier before the actual name. And I'll come back to why in a moment. Again, we've called the location UK South, keeping it consistent. I could use the same dot notation as above, but I just want to keep it simple for this episode. The resource group that it's going to be under is, again, Liam DevOps series. And the app service plan ID, these are all required. By the way, I forgot to mention, these are all required for Terraform to be able to create this resource. And I'm just going to be calling the ID. So I'm going to give the app service plan ID, and I'm going to call it the ID of the app service plan. It kind of sounds a bit odd saying that, but yes, that's what I'm doing. I'm grabbing the ID from the one above. Next, you want to look at the site configuration. So every single time when we went through the app service creation in the portal, there was like a whole bunch of lists and ticks and boxes and typing that I had to do to be able to set it up with names, where you want it, what kind of machine it's going to run. Is it going to be a Docker container? Is it going to be a Git repo? This is where we specify all those site configurations. Because our app service plan is is of Linux type, we need to give it the Linux FX version, which is the Linux box that we want to run this on. And again, this all ties back to when we were building our binary for the Linux version. We are building the container for a Linux box, keeping it consistent. And this is where I put Docker, and this is where I'm going to call it the container registry and the image. So as we can see here, it's Docker DevOps on Azure.azurecr.io/DOA. So DevOps on Azure, episode 1, version 1. So that was the first image we made, and it's version 1. And I'm going to say always on is false. So by default, I think it actually goes to true, but we don't always want this box to be on. We want it to shut down after a period of inactivity. So now we've done the site configuration of what that's actually going to be doing. We need to put in some app settings. So we've specified that we want the Docker engine or the Docker daemon to run and pull this image from this registry, but we need to say how. So we're going to add some app settings. So this is very much what you'd see in the portal. And again, I've left this in here because I'm going to come straight back to that at the end. But if you went into the app portal and we looked at the app itself, if I just quickly whiz through here, we can look at the configuration, I think it is. It's one of these, deployment central configuration. Here we go, yeah. So we can see here, we've got the name and the value. So Docker enable CI, we've got the registry server password, the URL, username, and the website storage. So we're very much specifying these variables at this point in the code. So like you see here, app settings, just like I've just run through on the website here, but I'm using something different. I'm using a variable because the last thing you want to do is commit API keys and credentials. I don't mind if my server URL goes in somewhere. That could be hard-coded, taken out. It doesn't bother. But it does bother me if my username and password are in Git. You don't want that in version control. So you want to abstract it. We're going to be taking it out, and we're going to use an environment variable. And I'll show you how that runs as well in a second when we run it. Lastly, for it, to close this block off, we need to say the identity is a system assigned. So what this actually means is Azure is going to generate the service principals for us. this is all to do with access and roles to the application itself, but we're just going to say, hey, I've got nobody else in here. I don't have any roles set up. For me, I'm just an admin. I'm going to let you do this for me. You assign it. You just let me access it. And people around, going to let it handle all of that for me. So a system assigned is the identity. And that is actually all of the code that we need to create an app service and an app service plan. Now, of course, there's ways you can abstract all of this data and have it pull from many different ways, like I've tried to show you with this one here, so random UUID. You can do a lot of this from previous blocks. So a lot of capturing data from returns of other blocks in different places. Now, a really interesting one is here, Docker enable CI. Now, I'll show you a pull request, which is actually going to allow me to do this, but let's go and deploy this first. Okay, so let's save this file. Let's open up a new terminal. And the 3 commands, if you remember, that I had to write were Terraform init, Terraform init. That's going to initialize this directory as a Terraform directory. It's going to grab the state. It's going to do a bunch of things, find the plugins, get the version, all that kind of stuff, all the goodness that we need to be able to deploy this. Awesome, it's successfully initialized. The last thing or the second thing I need to do is a Terraform plan. And what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that I can do everything that I want to do. It's going to ask me for my environment variables. Now, you can grab this from your shell. So you can do an export and export the environment variable to your shell, and of which we will do that in a moment. But for this, and for anybody watching, I will be changing these credentials straight after the stream. So for the password, we're going to pop that one in. And for the username, we're going to put DevOps on Azure. So that's the username and password of my container registry. And all it's going to do is it's going to make sure that I can actually create these in the cloud. So give that a moment. It'll probably take a minute or two. What else? Yeah, that's all it's going to be doing. Cool. So that passed. It means it said, you know what, Liam, yes, you can go ahead and create this if you want to. And because I didn't put any other options, it hasn't gone ahead and applied it. But if we wanted to, we can export. Now, if we want to export something, we have to do it with a TF var. And what that means is if I just run this command here, so if I was to export it to my shell, so export TF underscore var underscore CR pass and give it that one, export it to my shell, and the same for a username. Hopefully it won't ask me to do that again when I apply it. So the last command that I need to go ahead and do is Terraform apply. And this is what may take a moment. But if you notice on the left-hand side, we've got like a whole bunch of files that are popping up and have started, been created. And what that's doing is just creating the state locally. So you wouldn't ever want to do this or commit half of these to Git because it's local state and you might have some variables in there. And of course, it's going to ask me if I want to really go ahead and do this. And I'm going to click yes. So as you can see, it gives you like a proper output, like a full run output of what it's running, when it's running it. So it's already created the unique identifier, which is this long number here with a few letters in, creating the app service plan. And it's still creating it. And this might actually take about 30 seconds to create, because if you remember, this wasn't actually quick in the portal either. But again, this is just grabbing or calling a bunch of APIs, which will create this service in the cloud. Now, if you did notice, it didn't ask me for the credentials again because I saved them to my shell and I was able to pull them out from the shell when I run it. But again, otherwise it will just, it will just ask you for it, prompt you for it. Great for pipelines because you can add it as an environment variable, but also perfectly good for your local environment too.